It was a Thursday evening when my wife, Emily, brought it up. We were sitting in the living room, her legs casually tucked under her as she scrolled through her phone. I'd just gotten home from work and was enjoying the rare calmness of the evening when she dropped a bombshell. "Jake," she began hesitantly, her eyes still glued to her screen, "you know Todd and Lisa, right? They've invited us to a party this Saturday." I nodded, assuming it was one of those casual neighborhood get-togethers. "Sure. What kind of party is it?" She paused for a moment, then tilted her head, her tone shifting into something too nonchalant to be genuine. "Well, it's not your average party. It's, more like a gathering for open-minded couples." The words hung in the air for a moment too long before my brain caught up. "Wait, what?" I set my beer down, staring at her. "Open-minded couples? Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Her gaze flicked up briefly before darting away. "It's not a big deal, Jake. It's just something fun. A way for people to explore, I guess. Todd and Lisa swear it's completely safe and respectful." I blinked at her, struggling to believe what I was hearing. "You're talking about a swingers party?" She nodded, her lips pressed into a tight smile as if waiting for my reaction. I laughed nervously, hoping this was some twisted joke. "You're kidding, right?" Her expression didn't change. "Jake, it's not what you're imagining. It's not sleazy or anything. Just a group of adults having fun. Honestly, it might even help us reconnect. Things have been kind of stale lately." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Sure, things between us hadn't been perfect, but was this her solution? "And you thought this would fix things?" My voice rose slightly. "I don't even know how to respond to that." Emily sighed, setting her phone down and folding her arms defensively. "I'm just saying we should consider it. It doesn't mean anything. It's just sex, Jake. Nothing emotional." The casualness of her tone made my blood boil. "It means something to me," I shot back. "I can't believe you'd even suggest this. Is there something you're not telling me?" Her cheeks flushed, but she quickly shook her head. "God, no, Jake. Why do you always jump to the worst conclusions? Todd and Lisa are married, and they're fine. They say it's strengthened their relationship, and you bought that crap?" I stood, unable to sit still any longer. "Emily, I don't know what's going on with you lately, but this crosses a line." I turned away, grabbing my coat from the chair. "I need some air." As I stepped outside into the cool night, 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Was this who she'd been all along? Or was this some new phase I hadn't noticed creeping in? I leaned against the porch railing, staring into the distance, wondering how my seemingly normal marriage had spiraled into this surreal conversation. What I didn't know then was that Emily's suggestion was just the tip of the iceberg. I spent the night on the couch, not because Emily asked me to, but because I couldn't bring myself to lie beside her. Her suggestion about the swingers party rattled me in ways I hadn't expected. I wasn't just hurt, I was confused. Was this about us? Or was it about something else entirely? The next morning, Emily acted as if nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek as I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, her bright smile contrasting starkly with the storm brewing inside me. "Have a good day at work," she chirped before heading out the door. I stared at her retreating figure, the ease of her demeanor unsettling. How could she act so normal after suggesting something so outrageous? At work, I couldn't focus. My coworkers noticed I was distracted, but I brushed off their concerns with excuses about stress. In truth, my mind was a hurricane of doubts and questions. Why was Emily so insistent? And why did she bring it up now? The day dragged, and when I finally got home, I noticed the first crack in her facade. Emily was on the phone, her back to me, speaking in hushed tones. The way she stiffened when I entered the room told me everything I needed to know. The call wasn't casual. She ended the conversation abruptly, turning to me with a forced smile. "Hey, you're home early." I glanced at the clock. "It's 6:30. That's my usual time." "Oh, right," she said, brushing past me to the kitchen. "How was your day?" "It was fine," I lied, keeping my tone even. "Who were you talking to?" Her hand froze mid-reach for a glass, but she recovered quickly, her voice light. "Lisa. Just finalizing some details for Saturday." I stiffened. So you're still planning to go? She turned to face me, her expression a mix of annoyance and disbelief. I thought we could talk about it, Jake. I mean, I wouldn't go without you. I crossed my arms, trying to keep my frustration in check. You know how I feel about this, Emily. And I don't understand why you're pushing it so hard. Her gaze softened, and she stepped closer, placing a hand on my arm. Jake, it's just, we've been in a rut, you know? I thought maybe this could shake things up. Shake things up? I repeated, incredulous. You think sleeping with other people is going to fix whatever you think is wrong with us? It's not like that, she insisted. It's just an experience, something new, and it doesn't have to mean anything. Her words felt hollow, and her eyes darted away from mine as she spoke. That's when it hit me. She wasn't just curious. She wanted this. She was more invested in this party than she was letting on. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Emily, tell me the truth. Is there something I should know? Is there someone else? Her eyes widened, and she shook her head quickly, but her reaction wasn't convincing. Of course not, Jake. How could you even ask that? Because this isn't you, I said, my voice rising. At least, it's not the you I thought I knew. For a moment, she looked like she might say something real, but she caught herself, her expression hardening. You know what, Jake? If you're not going to trust me, then maybe you should think about what that says about our relationship. She walked past me, retreating to the bedroom and slamming the door. I stood in the living room, my fists clenched and my chest tight. Something wasn't adding up, and deep down, I knew I couldn't just let it go. After a restless night, I made a decision. If she was going to this party, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. Whether she liked it or not, I was going to find out the truth. The next morning, Emily was already up and dressed when I came downstairs. She greeted me with a half-hearted smile, her tone unusually neutral. I'm meeting Lisa for brunch. Do you want me to bring you anything back? I shook my head. No, I'm good. Okay, she said, grabbing her purse. I'll see you later. The door shut behind her, and I stood there, the gears in my mind turning. Something about her recent behavior didn't sit right. She wasn't usually so secretive, and the tension between us wasn't something she could easily brush off. I glanced at the clock. If she was with Lisa, she wouldn't be back for a while. I knew it wasn't exactly ethical, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Against my better judgment, I grabbed her laptop from the counter. She wasn't careless with her passwords, but over the years, I'd picked up on a few patterns she used. After a few tries, I was in. I clicked through her emails and calendar, but found nothing unusual. Just as I was about to give up, I noticed a folder on the desktop labeled Projects. Emily had mentioned using it for work, so I hesitated before clicking it open. What I found wasn't work-related at all. Inside was a subfolder with the name Weekend Plans. My stomach dropped as I opened it. There were emails and messages, not between her and Lisa, but between her and Todd, Lisa's husband. The first few messages seemed innocent enough, discussing logistics for the party. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. Looking forward to seeing you, one message read, accompanied by a winking emoji. Another said, don't forget what we talked about. Saturday's going to be amazing. The most damning one was a short message from a few days earlier. Can't wait to finally make it happen. You sure Jake's okay with this? My chest tightened as I stared at the screen. The implications were clear. This wasn't just about the party. Emily and Todd had been talking behind my back, and this wasn't some harmless experiment. It was premeditated. I closed the laptop, my hands shaking. My thoughts raced. Was this why Emily had been so insistent? Had this been about Todd all along? And Lisa? Did she know? I needed answers, but confronting Emily outright wouldn't work. She'd deny everything, twist it around, or find some way to justify it. Instead, I needed to catch her in her own web. When she came home later that afternoon, I pretended nothing was wrong. She was cheerful, like she hadn't just spent the morning scheming. How was brunch? I asked, keeping my tone light. Good, she said, unpacking a to-go bag. I brought you a sandwich, just in case you got hungry. I forced a smile, thanking her as I took the bag. But inside, I felt hollow. The woman in front of me wasn't the person I thought I'd married. She was a stranger, and this weekend, I planned to find out exactly how far she'd fallen. For the rest of the day, I acted as normal as possible, even suggesting we have dinner together. She seemed surprised but agreed, likely thinking it was my way of smoothing things over after our argument. What she didn't know was that I'd already made plans of my own. Come Saturday night, I wasn't just going to sit idly by. If Emily was going to this party, I was going too, whether she wanted me there or not. Saturday came quickly, and Emily seemed to be in an uncharacteristically good mood. She spent the day bustling around the house, tidying up and even humming to herself as she folded laundry. It would have been endearing under different circumstances, but now it only fueled my suspicion. By mid-afternoon, she disappeared upstairs to get ready. I stayed on the couch, flipping through the channels aimlessly, my mind far from the screen. I'd already made my preparations. I'd reached out to an old friend, Kyle, who was always up for a little covert adventure. We'd known each other since college, and when I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate to offer his help. At around 5:30, Emily emerged, dressed to kill in a sleek black dress that hugged her figure. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was subtle but flawless. She looked stunning, but all I could feel was a mix of anger and sadness. "I'm heading out," she said, grabbing her purse. "Are you sure you don't want to come? It might be fun." I gave her a weak smile. "Nah, you go ahead. I'll probably just order a pizza and watch a movie." She hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching mine, but I held my expression steady. Finally, she nodded. "All right, don't wait up." The door closed behind her, and I waited just long enough to make sure she was gone before springing into action. I grabbed my jacket and phone, texting Kyle that it was time. He picked me up a few blocks away to avoid suspicion, and we headed to the address I'd pulled from Emily's messages. The party was being held at Todd and Lisa's house, a sprawling suburban property with an oversized driveway already packed with cars. The glowing lights and muffled music told us the party was in full swing. "You ready for this?" Kyle asked, his tone laced with concern. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure I was. "Let's do it." We parked a few houses down and approached on foot, keeping to the shadows. From the outside, it looked like any normal gathering. Groups of people chatting on the patio, the occasional burst of laughter. But as we got closer, the conversations took on a different tone, and I caught snippets that made my stomach churn. "Did you see Emily?" a woman giggled. "She's a firecracker tonight." "I hear Todd's been waiting for this one," a man added with a knowing laugh. Kyle shot me a glance, but I didn't respond. My heart was pounding too hard to form words. We slipped around to the back of the house, where a tall privacy fence enclosed the yard. Through the slats, I could see a hot tub bubbling in the corner, steam rising into the night air. A small group of people was gathered nearby, drinks in hand, their laughter mingling with the music. Then I saw her. Emily was standing with Todd, his arm casually draped around her waist. She was laughing at something he'd said, her body angled toward him in a way that felt too familiar, too intimate. Lisa was nearby, chatting with another couple, but her gaze kept drifting toward Emily and Todd. There was no anger or jealousy in her expression, just amusement, like she was in on the joke. I clenched my fists, every muscle in my body screaming to storm in and confront them. But Kyle grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Not yet," he said quietly. "You want proof, remember?" I took a shaky breath, nodding. He was right. If I went in now, it would just turn into a he-said-she-said mess. I needed undeniable evidence. Kyle handed me his phone, already recording, and I held it steady as I zoomed in on the scene. Emily leaned closer to Todd, whispering something in his ear that made him laugh and tighten his grip on her waist. The sight of it made my blood boil, but I forced myself to keep filming. Minutes felt like hours as I watched, every moment chipping away at the foundation of my marriage. Finally, Emily and Todd started to move, heading toward the house. Lisa followed, a sly smile playing on her lips. "This is it," I whispered, handing the phone back to Kyle. "I'm going in." He nodded, staying back to keep filming while I circled around to the front door. I didn't knock. I didn't hesitate. I walked in, letting the door slam behind me. The party buzzed with energy, but heads turned as I made my way through the crowd. My eyes locked on the hallway where Emily had disappeared. Someone tried to stop me, a man I didn't recognize, but I brushed him off, my focus unyielding. I followed the sound of laughter and voices until I reached a closed door. Without thinking, I shoved it open. What I saw on the other side made my heart stop. Emily was there, her hands on Todd's chest, their faces inches apart. Lisa stood nearby, her expression one of detached amusement, as if she were watching a scene from a movie rather than her husband with another woman. Jake? Emily's voice was sharp with shock, her face going pale as she spotted me. For a moment, none of us moved. The room was silent, save for the muffled music from the party outside. Then Todd had the audacity to smirk. "Guess we didn't need to wait for the invitation," he said casually. I felt the weight of every betrayal crash down on me at once. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling with anger. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, it was Lisa who spoke, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "Well, this is awkward," she said, taking a sip of her drink. "But you knew what kind of party this was, right, Jake?" I glared at her, my fists clenched. "I knew you were all liars. But this is beyond anything I imagined." Emily finally found her voice, stepping forward with her hands raised as if to calm me. "Jake, please, it's not what it looks like." Her words were so absurd, so insulting, that I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "Really, Emily? Because it looks like you've been planning this for weeks." The color drained from her face, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. Todd tried to interject, but I silenced. Todd tried to interject, stepping forward with that smug smirk still plastered on his face. "Look, man, maybe you should calm down. You're making a scene." I rounded on him, my voice a low growl. "A scene? This is my marriage you're talking about, not some cheap drama you can brush off." Emily grabbed my arm, her grip weak and trembling. "Jake, let's talk about this. Somewhere private, okay?" I shook her off, glaring at her. "Private? You mean like how you planned this private little rendezvous with Todd? Behind my back?" Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't moved. Not this time. The betrayal was too raw, too fresh. Lisa, meanwhile, stood against the wall, sipping her drink as if this were the most entertaining part of her evening. Her indifference lit a new fire in me. "And you," I spat, turning to Lisa. "You knew about this, didn't you? Hell, you probably encouraged it." Lisa raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Todd and Emily are adults. They make their own decisions. I didn't force anyone into anything." "Unbelievable," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "This whole thing is just a game to you people." Emily stepped between us, her voice trembling. "Jake, please stop. I can explain." I turned to her, the weight of everything crashing down on me. "Explain? You've been lying to me for weeks, Emily. Months, maybe. And for what? To sleep with Todd? To explore whatever this is? What the hell is wrong with you?" She flinched at my words, the tears now streaming freely down her cheeks. "I didn't mean for it to get this far. I swear. It was just supposed to be harmless fun." "Harmless fun." I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow even to my own ears. "Do you hear yourself? How is this harmless, Emily? You've completely destroyed the trust we had." Todd crossed his arms, clearly tired of playing the silent observer. "Look, Jake, if you're so uptight about it, maybe this isn't the place for you. Not everyone's cut out for this lifestyle." I took a step toward him, my fists clenched, and he held up his hands, feigning innocence. "Whoa, whoa. No need to get physical. We're all adults here." "Adults?" I hissed. "You're a homewrecker who doesn't know the first thing about respect." Before I could do something I might regret, Kyle appeared in the doorway, his face tight with worry. "Jake, let's go. You've got everything you need." I glanced at him, then at the phone in his hand. My stomach churned at the thought of what was now captured on video, but I knew he was right. Staying here wouldn't fix anything. It would only make things worse. Emily reached for me again, her voice breaking. "Jake, please, don't leave like this. Let's talk. We can work through this." I stared at her, the woman I'd once loved more than anything, and felt a pang of sorrow for what we'd lost. But her words rang hollow. "Work through this," I repeated, shaking my head. "Emily, you crossed a line I didn't even know existed. There's no coming back from this." I turned to leave, Kyle falling into step beside me. Todd called something after us, but I didn't hear it. The blood rushing in my ears drowned out everything else. As we stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt the weight of the evening settle on my shoulders. "You okay?" Kyle asked, his voice cautious. I nodded numbly, though I wasn't sure it was true. "Let's just go." As we drove away, I stared out the window, my mind racing. The house and the party faded into the distance, but the images of what I'd seen and heard were burned into my memory. This wasn't just a mistake or a lapse in judgment. Emily had made a choice to betray me, to lie, and to destroy everything we'd built. And now, I had a choice to make, too. One thing was clear. Our marriage was never going to be the same. The drive home was quiet, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. Kyle didn't push me to talk, for which I was grateful. I needed time to process everything I'd seen and heard. My chest felt heavy, like someone had dropped a concrete block on it. By the time we reached my house, the adrenaline that had fueled me all evening had worn off, leaving me emotionally drained. "You sure you're good?" Kyle asked as I opened the car door. "Yeah," I muttered, though I was far from it. "Thanks for tonight. I owe you." "You don't owe me anything, man," he said firmly. "Just let me know if you need anything, all right?" I nodded and stepped out of the car, watching as he drove off into the night. When I walked into the house, the silence was deafening. I dropped my keys on the counter and slumped onto the couch, staring blankly at the wall. The events of the night played over and over in my mind like a broken record. Emily, Todd, the smug looks, the lies, the betrayal. I wanted to feel anger, pure, righteous fury, but all I felt was a deep, gnawing sadness. How had we gotten here? We weren't perfect, sure, but I never thought we'd end up like this. I'd always believed that, no matter what, we'd face life's challenges together. But now it was clear. Emily had been walking away from us for a long time. The sound of my phone buzzing snapped me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen and saw Emily's name. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, it buzzed again and again. By the fifth call, I finally picked up. "What do you want, Emily?" I asked, my voice flat. She hesitated, her voice thick with emotion. "Jake, please, just let me explain." "You had your chance to explain," I shot back. "Back at the party. But instead, you lied. Again." "I wasn't lying," she insisted. I didn't know how to say it, okay? I didn't want to hurt you." I laughed bitterly. "Didn't want to hurt me? Emily, you've been lying to me for weeks, maybe months. And then you dragged me into this circus of a party and expected me to just, what? Be okay with it?" Her voice cracked. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought if you saw it, you'd understand." "Understand?" I snapped. "Understand that you've been sneaking around with my so-called best friend? That you've turned our marriage into a joke?" "Jake, it's not like that," she pleaded. "I didn't mean to." "Stop," I interrupted, my tone cold. "Just stop. I don't want to hear your excuses anymore." The line went quiet, and for a moment, I thought she'd hung up. Then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake." "Yeah, you did," I said. "A mistake you can't take back." I ended the call before she could respond, tossing my phone onto the coffee table. My heart was pounding, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, heartbreak, and exhaustion. I spent the rest of the night pacing the house, replaying every moment of the evening in my mind. By the time the sun started to rise, I'd made my decision. Emily had made her choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. The first thing I did was call a lawyer. I explained the situation as clearly and calmly as I could, including the video evidence Kyle had captured. The lawyer listened intently, then assured me I had a solid case for divorce. Hearing those words felt like a double-edged sword. Relief that I could take action, but also the painful realization that this was really happening. By mid-morning, I was back at the house, sorting through our shared belongings. I packed up Emily's things, everything that reminded me of her, and piled the boxes neatly in the garage. I couldn't bear to look at them any longer. It was around noon when Emily showed up. She looked like she hadn't slept, her makeup smudged and her hair a mess. She stood in the doorway, clutching her purse like a lifeline. "Jake, can we talk?" she asked, her voice trembling. I crossed my arms, blocking her path. "There's nothing left to say, Emily. Your stuff's in the garage. Take it and go." Her eyes widened, and she shook her head. "Jake, please. Don't do this. We can fix this." "Fix what?" I said, my voice rising. "You betrayed me, Emily. You lied to me. You made a fool out of me in front of everyone." Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't falter. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she sobbed. I didn't think it through." "That much is obvious," I said coldly, "but that doesn't change anything." She tried to step closer, but I held up a hand to stop her. "We're done, Emily. I've already started the process. My lawyer will be in touch." Her face crumpled, and she stumbled back as if I'd struck her. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of guilt, but I quickly pushed it aside. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her shoulders shaking as she cried. I watched her go, the finality of it sinking in. As the garage door closed behind her, I felt a strange mix of emotions: grief for what we'd lost, anger at what she'd done, and a faint glimmer of hope for what might come next. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: I was finally free. As the sound of Emily's car faded down the street, the house felt eerily quiet. For the first time in years, it was entirely mine. No Emily humming in the kitchen. No shared laughter over old sitcoms. Just silence. I sat on the couch, staring at the boxes in the garage visible through the window. They contained the physical remnants of our life together: clothes, trinkets, photos, but none of the warmth or meaning those objects once held. It was a surreal feeling, as though I'd just removed an anchor that had kept my life grounded, only to realize it was dragging me down all along. It didn't take long for the calls and texts to start pouring in. Mutual friends, Emily's family, even Todd. I ignored most of them, but one message from Lisa caught my attention. "Jake, call me when you get a chance. There's something you need to know." I debated whether to respond. Lisa had been complicit in the betrayal, standing idly by while her husband pursued my wife. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and I called her. "Lisa," I said flatly when she answered. "What do you want?" She sighed, her voice heavy with a mix of guilt and frustration. "Jake, I need to apologize. I should have said something sooner, but I didn't know how. Todd's been like this for years. It's not just Emily." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" "I mean, he's done this before," she admitted. "More times than I can count. He has this way of getting into people's heads, making them think it's harmless fun. But it's not. It never is." I clenched my jaw, my anger boiling over. "And you let him? You just stood by and let him destroy marriages?" Her silence was answer enough. Finally, she said, "I didn't know how to stop it, Jake. And before you ask, yes, I've thought about leaving him. But he always finds a way to reel me back in." "Save your excuses," I snapped. "You could have stopped this before it started." "I know," she said softly, "and I'll have to live with that. But you should know, Emily wasn't the first, and she probably won't be the last." "Why are you telling me this now?" I demanded. "Because I'm done being complicit," Lisa said. "I've seen too many people get hurt, and I can't stay silent anymore. I'm sorry for what you've been through. You didn't deserve this." I ended the call without responding, my hands trembling as I set the phone down. Her words echoed in my mind, twisting the knife that was already lodged deep in my chest. This wasn't just about Emily or Todd. It was a pattern, a toxic game they played at the expense of others. Over the next few days, I threw myself into the practicalities of moving forward. I met with my lawyer, finalized the details of the divorce filing, and changed the locks on the house. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, though the process was far from easy. Emily tried to contact me several times, leaving tearful voicemails and lengthy texts filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Her words meant nothing to me anymore. The damage was done. One evening, as I was sorting through paperwork, I found a stack of old photos buried in a drawer. Most of them were from happier times, holidays, vacations, random candid moments. In one, Emily was laughing at something just out of frame, her eyes bright and full of life. I stared at the photo for a long time, wondering how we'd gone from that to this. It wasn't long before the questions started creeping in. Had there been warning signs I'd missed? Red flags I'd ignored? Had I been blind to who Emily really was, or had she changed over time? The self-doubt was crushing, but I forced myself to push through it. This wasn't my fault. I didn't make the choice to betray. I didn't lie. Those decisions were hers, and hers alone. A week after that disastrous night, Kyle came over with a six-pack and a bag of takeout. We sat on the porch, the cool evening air a welcome respite from the suffocating weight of everything. "You holding up?" he asked, handing me a beer. I shrugged. "I guess. Some days are better than others." He nodded, taking a swig of his drink. "For what it's worth, you're handling this better than most people would." "Am I?" I asked, my voice heavy. "Because it doesn't feel like it." Kyle gave me a small smile. "Yeah, you are. You're not wallowing in self-pity or pretending it didn't happen. You're taking steps to move forward, and that's more than a lot of people can say." His words offered a sliver of comfort, though the wound was still raw. I wasn't sure what moving forward looked like yet, but I knew I had to figure it out, for my own sake. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the porch in shadow, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me that this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where I could finally start putting myself first. It had been nearly 2 weeks since I'd last seen Emily, and in that time, I'd managed to carve out a semblance of a routine. Work kept me occupied during the day, and in the evenings, I'd either lose myself in a book or take long walks through the neighborhood. Anything to keep my mind from spiraling back to that night. But just as I was beginning to find my footing, Emily showed up unannounced. I'd just come back from the grocery store when I found her sitting on the porch steps, her head bowed and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up when she heard my car pull into the driveway, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Jake," she said softly, standing as I approached. I stopped a few feet away, keeping my expression neutral. "What are you doing here, Emily?" "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. "Please." I hesitated. The part of me that once loved her warring with the part that wanted nothing to do with her anymore. Finally, I sighed and motioned toward the porch. "Fine. Talk." She perched on the edge of the step, wringing her hands nervously. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see right now, but I just needed to see you. To try to explain." "Explain what?" I asked, crossing my arms. "Why you lied. Why you betrayed me. Why you turned our marriage into a joke." She flinched at my words, but I didn't pull back. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. "I know I hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I screwed up in ways I can't even begin to make up for. But Jake, I was lost. I felt like we were drifting apart, and I didn't know how to fix it. So your solution was Todd?" I spat. "You thought sleeping with my so-called best friend would solve our problems?" "It wasn't about Todd," she insisted, her tears flowing freely now. It was about feeling wanted, feeling alive again. And I know that's a horrible excuse, but it's the truth." I shook my head, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Feeling wanted? Emily, I wanted you. I've always wanted you. You're the one who threw that away, not me." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I didn't know how to stop," she whispered. "Once it started, I couldn't stop. And then it was too late." For a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy, but it was quickly snuffed out by the memory of her betrayal. "You should have thought about that before you dragged me into this mess," I said coldly. "Before you destroyed everything we had." She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "Jake, please. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm begging you to give me another chance. I'll do anything. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us. I stared at her, the woman I once thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, and felt nothing but emptiness. Her tears didn't move me. Her pleas didn't soften me. The damage was too great, the trust too broken. There is no us anymore, I said, my voice firm. You made sure of that. Her face crumpled, and she let out a choked sob. Jake, please, she whispered. Don't do this. I'm not the one doing this, I said, stepping past her toward the door. You did this, Emily, and now you have to live with it. I unlocked the door and went inside, leaving her sobbing on the porch. The sound of her cries echoed faintly through the closed door, but I didn't turn back. I couldn't. As I stood in the quiet of my living room, I felt a strange sense of closure. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the need to question what had gone wrong or wonder if I could have done something differently. I didn't feel anger or heartbreak or confusion. I just felt done. The woman sitting on my porch wasn't the Emily I'd fallen in love with. She wasn't the woman I'd built a life with. She was someone else entirely, someone I didn't know, and someone I didn't want to know anymore. I heard her car start up a few minutes later, the sound fading into the distance. I stood there for a long time after she was gone, the weight of finality settling over me like a heavy blanket. This was it, the end, and as painful as it was also freeing. For the first time in a long time, I could finally start looking forward. The days that followed Emily's visit were a strange mix of relief and melancholy. Her departure felt like the final chapter of a story I hadn't wanted to end but knew couldn't continue. For the first time in years, I was alone in the truest sense of the word, and I wasn't sure how to feel about it. At work, I threw myself into my projects, staying late to avoid the quiet emptiness of the house. My coworkers noticed the change, but wisely didn't press me for details. At home, I busied myself with small tasks, reorganizing the garage, repainting the guest room, even attempting to cook meals more elaborate than takeout. Despite my efforts to stay distracted, reminders of Emily lingered everywhere. Her perfume still faintly clung to the pillows. Her favorite mug sat untouched in the cabinet. Even the small garden she tended in the backyard felt like a ghost of her presence. One evening, I found myself standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by traces of a life that no longer existed, and I realized it was time to let go. The next weekend, I rented a storage unit and packed away everything that reminded me of her. Photos, mementos, even the furniture we'd picked out together. All went into boxes. I left the house feeling lighter, as though a weight I hadn't fully understood was finally lifting. As I began reclaiming my space, I also started reaching out to friends I'd drifted away from over the years. Kyle, who had been my rock through the chaos, invited me out for drinks with a group of mutual friends. At first, I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to be social again, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. The bar was loud and crowded, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude I'd grown accustomed to. I was nervous at first, but as the night wore on, I found myself laughing and chatting like the old days. It felt good to be around people who didn't see me as Jake, the guy whose marriage fell apart. For a few hours, I wasn't a man piecing his life back together. I was just Jake. Toward the end of the night, Kyle pulled me aside, a knowing grin on his face. So, he said, nodding toward a woman sitting at the bar. She's been looking over here all night. You gonna go talk to her, or what? I glanced at the woman, tall, brunette, with an easy smile, and shook my head. Not tonight, man. Kyle frowned, but he didn't push. All right, but when you're ready, you know where to find me. I appreciated his understanding. The truth was, I wasn't ready. The idea of starting something new felt impossible, like trying to rebuild a house on a foundation that was still cracked. I needed more time to figure out who I was without Emily, to understand what I wanted for my future. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself thinking about the woman at the bar. She wasn't Emily, and maybe that was the point. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rediscovering myself. I started running again, something I'd given up years ago. I joined a local photography group, dusting off the camera that had been sitting in my closet. Slowly but surely, I began to feel like myself again, stronger, freer, and more alive than I'd felt in years. The divorce process moved forward, and while there were moments of tension, mostly over finances, Emily and I kept our interactions limited to lawyers and paperwork. Each step brought me closer to closure, though I knew true healing would take time. One afternoon, I found myself back in the garden, pulling weeds and turning the soil. It had been Emily's space, but now it was mine. I decided to plant something new, something that would remind me of this chapter of my life, not the one that came before. As I worked, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about the past or dreading the future. I was just here, in the moment, and that was enough. I wasn't sure what the road ahead would look like, but I knew one thing for certain. I was ready to walk it. Alone or with someone new, I would keep moving forward. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I believed I could. As the weeks turned into months, the divorce process crept forward like a slow-moving storm. My lawyer, Janet, had been an absolute force, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who made it clear from the beginning that she wouldn't let me get steamrolled. Thanks to the video evidence Kyle had captured and the clear-cut nature of Emily's betrayal, the legal negotiations were largely in my favor. Emily, however, didn't make things easy. Her initial tearful pleas to reconcile had gradually transformed into defensive hostility. Through her lawyer, she contested everything she could. The division of assets, the timeline of separation, even the simplest agreements. It wasn't just about fighting for what she wanted. It felt like she was trying to make the process as painful as possible for me. One afternoon, Janet called with a new development. "Jake, Emily's lawyer reached out," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "They're claiming you've been withholding community assets." "Community assets?" I asked, incredulous. "What assets? I've been transparent about everything." She sighed. "Apparently, Emily believes there's a savings account you haven't disclosed, something she says you've been contributing to without her knowledge." I laughed bitterly. If I had a secret stash of cash, don't you think I'd have used it to get out of this mess faster? "I figured as much," Janet said. "But I need you to gather all your financial records, bank statements, pay stubs, anything that can disprove her claim. This kind of accusation is common in cases like this, but it's still a headache." That evening, I sat at the dining table, sorting through years of financial paperwork. As I sifted through old statements, I felt the weight of everything Emily and I had once shared. The house we almost bought, the trips we'd saved for, the dreams we talked about building together. Now it was all reduced to line items and balances, evidence for a courtroom battle. By the time I sent everything over to Janet, it was well past midnight. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted but oddly resolute. Emily could throw as many accusations as she wanted, but I wasn't going to let her drag me down any further. A week later, we had our final mediation session. It was the first time I'd seen Emily since the night she showed up on my porch, and the sight of her stirred an unexpected mix of emotions. She looked tired, her eyes dull, her posture slouched, but there was a defiance in her expression that reminded me of the woman I used to love. We sat on opposite sides of a sterile conference room, flanked by our lawyers. Janet was calm and composed, while Emily's lawyer seemed frazzled, flipping through papers as though searching for a magic bullet. When the mediator entered, the room fell silent. The session began with the usual formalities, but it quickly became clear that Emily had no intention of compromising. She interrupted repeatedly, her voice sharp as she argued over everything from the furniture to the credit card debt. "Why should he get the car?" she snapped at one point, her face flushed. "I drove it more than he did." "Because I've already paid off the loan," I replied evenly, "with my income, while you were otherwise occupied." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Janet gave me a subtle nod, silently urging me to keep my composure. The session dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity, but eventually, we reached the point of no return. The mediator summarized the terms. The house was mine, the car was mine, and the few remaining joint assets would be divided according to the original agreement. Emily's objections had been overruled at nearly every turn. When the session ended, I stood to leave, but Emily stopped me. "Jake, wait," she said, her voice softer now. I turned to face her, keeping my expression neutral. "What is it?" Her eyes searched mine, a flicker of the woman I'd once known shining through. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for everything. I didn't mean for it to end like this." I studied her for a long moment, unsure if her words were genuine or just another attempt to manipulate me. Finally, I nodded. "I hope you figure out what you're looking for, Emily." With that, I walked out of the conference room, the weight of her apology lingering in the air but not penetrating the walls I'd built around myself. As I stepped into the sunlight outside, a strange sense of relief washed over me. It wasn't joy or triumph, just a quiet, steady calm. The storm was finally over, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. This wasn't the ending I'd envisioned when I married Emily, but it was the ending I needed. Now, it was time to start writing the next chapter of my life. And this time, I'd be doing it on my own terms. The finalization of the divorce came with a mix of emotions I hadn't fully prepared for. Relief, certainly, but also a profound sense of loss. Not just for Emily, but for the life I thought we were building together. The future we had talked about in those late-night conversations that now felt like a lifetime ago. The first few weeks after the paperwork was signed were a blur. I threw myself into anything that could keep my mind occupied. Work, hobbies, even volunteering at a local animal shelter. The distractions helped, but there was no escaping the quiet moments when the full weight of everything would settle over me. Nights were the hardest, the silence of the house amplifying the echoes of a past I was trying to leave behind. One evening, Kyle invited me to a gathering at his place. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small group of friends, some drinks, and a barbecue in his backyard. At first, I wasn't sure I wanted to go. Socializing felt like a task rather than an escape, but Kyle was persistent, and I eventually gave in. The gathering turned out to be exactly what I needed. The laughter, the easy conversation, the feeling of being surrounded by people who didn't see me as the guy going through a divorce, but just as Jake. It was refreshing. I even found myself genuinely smiling, a rare occurrence in recent months. At one point, I found myself chatting with a woman named Claire, who was a friend of one of Kyle's coworkers. She was warm and down-to-earth, with an infectious laugh that made it impossible not to smile along with her. We talked about everything and nothing, from our favorite books to the absurdity of reality TV. For the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of something I couldn't quite name. But as the night wore on, I found myself hesitating. The idea of starting something new, opening myself up to someone else, felt daunting, almost impossible. The scars Emily had left were still fresh, and the thought of letting someone in again was terrifying. Claire must have sensed my hesitation because she didn't push. When the night ended, she handed me a slip of paper with her number and a simple message. "No pressure. Just if you feel like talking." For days, I stared at that slip of paper, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to call her, to take a leap and see where it might lead. But another part of me, the part still licking its wounds, wasn't sure if I was ready. In the end, I decided to take it one step at a time. I didn't call her, but I kept the number, tucked away in a drawer like a small piece of hope I wasn't ready to let go of. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my world, one piece at a time. I redecorated the house, turning it into a space that reflected who I was now rather than who I had been with Emily. I picked up old hobbies I'd abandoned during my marriage, photography, hiking, even a bit of woodworking. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like myself again, or maybe a new version of myself, one who had been tempered by pain but wasn't defined by it. One sunny Saturday morning, I found myself standing in the garden I'd replanted. The new flowers were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the barren patch they'd replaced. It felt symbolic somehow, a physical representation of the growth I was striving for in my own life. As I tended to the flowers, a neighbor I didn't know well strolled by and stopped to chat. She complimented the garden and mentioned how much happier I seemed lately. Her words caught me off guard, but they also made me realize something. She was right. I was happier. Not in a loud, exuberant way, but in a quiet, steady sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in months, I felt like I was no longer defined by what had happened to me. Emily's betrayal and the divorce were parts of my story, yes, but they weren't the whole story. I was more than the pain, more than the heartbreak, more than the mistakes and regrets. As the neighbor walked away, I stood there in the sunlight, feeling the warmth on my face and the soft breeze rustling the flowers. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The days turned into weeks, and life continued its slow march forward. Each morning felt a little lighter, the weight of everything I'd been carrying gradually lifting. It wasn't that I'd forgotten what had happened. It was that I was learning to live with it. Emily's betrayal and the fallout of our marriage had left scars, but they weren't the defining features of my life anymore. They were just part of the tapestry. One evening, while scrolling through my phone, I came across the slip of paper Claire had given me at Kyle's barbecue. Her number was scrawled in neat handwriting, along with the words, "No pressure." I stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to reach out. It wasn't just fear holding me back. It was the nagging doubt that I wasn't ready, that I was still too broken, too raw to open myself up to someone new. But then I thought about the way she'd laughed at my lame jokes, the way her eyes had sparkled when she talked about her favorite books. She wasn't Emily, and that was the point. I took a deep breath and typed out a simple message. "Hey, it's Jake. Not sure if you remember me from Kyle's barbecue, but I figured I'd take you up on that no-pressure offer. Hope you're doing well." I hit send before I could overthink it, my heart pounding as I stared at the screen. Minutes passed, then my phone buzzed. Her response was quick and lighthearted. "Jake. Of course, I remember. Glad you reached out. I'm doing great. How about you?" We texted back and forth for a while, the conversation flowing as easily as it had that night at Kyle's. She asked about my garden, and I sent her a picture of the flowers I'd planted. She joked about how her own attempts at gardening had ended in disaster and asked if I could give her some tips. It was simple, unassuming, and exactly what I needed. Over the next few weeks, Claire and I kept in touch. Our conversations were casual at first, mostly about hobbies and shared interests, but gradually, we started opening up about deeper things. I told her about the divorce, not all the gritty details, but enough for her to understand why I'd been hesitant to reach out. She didn't judge or press me for more. Instead, she shared her own stories of heartbreak and healing, her words a reminder that everyone carries their own burdens. Eventually, she suggested meeting up for coffee. I agreed, though the idea of a first date, if that's what this was, made me nervous. When the day came, I almost backed out, but then I remembered how far I'd come, how hard I'd worked to rebuild myself. This wasn't just about Claire. It was about proving to myself that I could move forward. We met at a small cafe in town, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and an endless supply of indie music. Claire was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a mug of tea and a book in hand. When she looked up and smiled, it felt like the first real spark of happiness I'd felt in months. The date was easy, comfortable. We talked and laughed for hours, and not once did I feel the shadow of my past looming over us. Claire wasn't trying to fix me or rush me into anything. She was just there, present and genuine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could be fully myself. When the night ended, we walked to the parking lot together. I thanked her for a lovely evening, and she grinned, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Jake, I'm glad you came," she said. "I like seeing this side of you." "This side?" I asked, curious. "The one that looks hopeful," she said simply. Her words stayed with me long after she drove away. She was right. I did feel hopeful, not just about Claire, but about life in general. For so long, I'd been focused on what I'd lost, on the pain and the betrayal. But now, for the first time, I was starting to think about what I could gain. The road ahead wasn't clear, and I knew there would still be moments of doubt and sadness. But as I stood in the quiet of my house that night, I realized something important. I wasn't broken. I wasn't stuck. I was healing. And that, I thought with a small smile, was enough. For now, after that first meeting with Claire, I felt a shift inside me. It was subtle, like the first rays of sunlight after a long, stormy night, but it was there. For so long, I'd let the pain of the past define me, weighing down every decision, every interaction. But now, I was starting to see glimpses of a future that wasn't shadowed by betrayal. Claire and I didn't rush into anything. We kept things light, texts, occasional phone calls, and a few more casual meetups at coffee shops and parks. She had a way of making me feel at ease, like I didn't have to prove anything to her. She didn't pry into my past, but she also didn't shy away when I brought it up. Instead, she listened, her understanding nods and kind words reassuring me that it was okay to carry scars. One evening, a few weeks after that first coffee date, Claire invited me to a local art exhibit. "It's nothing fancy," she said over the phone, "but it might be fun. Plus, they have free wine." I chuckled. You had me at free wine. The exhibit was held in a small, charming gallery tucked into the heart of downtown. The space buzzed with quiet energy, filled with people sipping wine and admiring the eclectic mix of paintings, sculptures, and photographs. Claire greeted me at the door, looking effortlessly radiant in a simple dress and a warm smile. We wandered through the gallery together, pointing out pieces that caught our attention and joking about the ones that didn't make sense. At one point, we stopped in front of a large abstract painting, a chaotic swirl of colors and textures that somehow worked together beautifully. "Reminds me of life," Claire said, tilting her head as she studied the piece. "Messy, unpredictable, but there's beauty in it, if you look close enough." Her words struck a chord, and I found myself nodding. "Yeah," I said softly, "I guess there is." As the evening went on, I realized how much I'd missed moments like these, simple, genuine connections without the weight of expectation or judgment. For so long, I'd been stuck in survival mode, just trying to get through each day. But now, with Claire by my side, I felt like I was finally starting to live again. Later, as we stood outside the gallery under the glow of the streetlights, Claire turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Jake," she began, hesitating slightly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, curious. "Do you ever feel like you're still holding on to something? From before, I mean." Her question caught me off guard, but I appreciated her honesty. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "Yeah," I admitted. "Sometimes. It's not as heavy as it used to be, but it's still there. I guess healing takes time." She nodded, her eyes soft. "It does. But for what it's worth, you're doing an amazing job. I can see it." Her words warmed me in a way I hadn't expected, and I felt a smile tugging at my lips. "Thanks, Claire. That means a lot." She reached out and gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "You've got this, Jake. I can tell." The evening ended with a hug that lingered just a little longer than usual, and as I watched her walk to her car, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: joy. Not the fleeting kind that comes and goes with distractions, but a quiet, steady joy rooted in the realization that I was capable of moving forward. That life, despite its messiness and unpredictability, still held beauty and promise. When I got home that night, I didn't feel the familiar ache of loneliness or the heaviness of regret. Instead, I felt hopeful, the kind of hope that whispered, "This is only the beginning." Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. The past few months had been a whirlwind of change, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the world didn't feel like it was caving in around me. Claire had become a steady presence in my life, not in a consuming or overwhelming way, but in a way that felt natural, easy. She didn't try to fix me or erase the past. She simply stood beside me as I navigated my way through it. One Saturday morning, as I sipped my coffee on the back porch, my phone buzzed with a text from her. "Claire, morning. How do you feel about a road trip?" Smiley face. I smiled, the spontaneity in her message already brightening my day. I typed back, "Me? Road trip? Depends. Where are we going?" Her response came almost immediately. "Somewhere fun. Pack an overnight bag. I'll pick you up in an hour." True to her word, Claire pulled into my driveway exactly an hour later, her car loaded with snacks, a playlist ready, and a mischievous grin that made it impossible to say no. "Trust me," she said as I climbed into the passenger seat. "You're going to love this." We drove for hours, the city fading into open highways and rolling hills. The conversation flowed effortlessly, punctuated by bursts of laughter and moments of comfortable silence. Claire had a way of making even the quiet moments feel meaningful, like they were part of some unspoken understanding between us. Eventually, We arrived at our destination, a small, picturesque lake nestled in the woods. The water shimmered under the afternoon sun, and the surrounding trees were alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost sacred, a stark contrast to the chaos I'd left behind. "Thought you could use a little getaway," Claire said, her eyes sparkling as she took in my reaction. "What do you think?" I turned to her, overwhelmed by her thoughtfulness. "It's perfect," I said honestly. "Thank you." We spent the rest of the day exploring the trails around the lake, skipping stones across the water, and talking about everything from childhood memories to our wildest dreams. Claire told me about her love for painting, something she hadn't done in years but wanted to pick up again. I shared my passion for photography and how I'd recently started capturing landscapes as a way to reconnect with myself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, we sat on the edge of the lake, our feet dangling over the water. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with the soft sounds of nature and the occasional ripple of fish breaking the surface. "Jake," Claire said softly, breaking the stillness, "I know you've been through a lot, and I don't want to rush anything, but I just want you to know I'm here for whatever you need. No pressure, no expectations. Just here." Her words hit me with a gentle force, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. Instead, I turned to her, letting the sincerity in her eyes reassure me that she meant every word. "Thank you," I said finally. "That means more than you know." We stayed there until the stars began to peek through the twilight, talking and laughing as if the rest of the world didn't exist. When we finally made our way back to the car, I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't experienced in years. That night, as we settled into the small cabin Claire had rented for the trip, I realized something important. For the first time since my life had fallen apart, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. I wasn't defined by the pain of the past anymore. I was building something new, something better. And Claire, with her unshakable kindness and infectious spirit, was a part of that. Not the whole of it. This journey was mine, but a part that made the road ahead feel a little less daunting and a lot more promising. As I drifted off to sleep that night, listening to the soft chirping of crickets outside, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time: peace. As the months turned into seasons, I found myself looking at the world through a new lens. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined me. It was part of my story, but it wasn't the end. One evening, Claire and I sat in my garden, the flowers blooming in vibrant colors around us. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, the kind of moment I used to take for granted but now cherish deeply. The soft hum of crickets filled the air, mingling with the warm breeze and the faint glow of string lights draped across the porch. Claire turned to me with a smile, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "You've come a long way, you know," she said, her voice gentle but steady. I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle over me. "Yeah," I said softly, "I have." The road ahead wasn't perfect. It never would be. Life was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes painful. But it was also beautiful, full of second chances and unexpected joys. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about learning from it, growing through it, and letting it shape me into someone stronger. As I looked out at the garden, the vibrant flowers swaying gently in the breeze, I felt a quiet sense of contentment. Life had thrown me into the depths, but I'd climbed out, scarred but not broken. Stronger, wiser, ready. I reached for Claire's hand, lacing my fingers through hers. She looked at me, her smile widening as if she understood what I was feeling without me needing to say a word. And maybe she did. The light of the setting sun bathed everything in a warm, golden glow, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: I was ready. Ready to embrace the messiness, the beauty, and the unpredictability of life. Ready to take risks, to open myself up, to love and be loved again. And as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, I realized something simple yet profound. I wasn't afraid anymore.